So let's get into this. One of my papers that I studied when I studied criminology was utilitarianism versus deontology. And I spoke about certain things in that, which is interesting because it's almost like they've read my papers, they've read my assessments, they've gone through my work. It's interesting. So I'm going to talk about this, what it means, break it down for you to understand. Sorry about the glare. I can't change it. It was okay the other day, but it's not now. Anyway, who cares? If you care, you're listening. If you don't, you don't care. Simple. So I studied criminology, as I've said, criminologist. And I studied aspects of utilitarianism and deontology. Now, this is one of my papers, as I just said. And I want to break this down so people can understand what it means. So utilitarianism is almost a branch of natural law. So you get natural laws. And the natural law is to be, everybody has a moral compass, that we also have a right to this under natural law, that we all have a specific set of laws to create, a human right, okay? So this is a natural law-based system. And then we have to really bridge that gap in understanding how it progressed to a utilitarian perspective. Now, this is where everyone has a right to happiness, fulfillment, and this actually gauges with the United Nations Conventions of Rights for a Child, okay? And the human rights, okay? So this is how it was built up, how people began to have a position of a human right in the first place. So if we understand that from these theories created an aspect of safety and an aspect of an underpinning of a law to protect us, to protect ourselves, to protect us. And what it did was, it was to aid in a nourishment of society and a state, right? To protect us, right? Under that scheme. So we knew that there was a bridge in understanding human rights, the rights for a child and the rights for humans in general to live in peace and prosperity, having their resources counted for. So we had that within us. We knew that was there for us and it was ours, okay? And it is ours, right? We're allowed. This is why human rights is there. This is why we have the Act. So I think we have a Human Rights Act 1998. I think there was some more added, but it was 1889 where the Child Acts were added. And essentially what it was to understand that we have a position where we are safe, okay? There is a safety net, okay? It's not to be used against us. It's actually a safety net, okay? To carry us like this. Yeah, like that. So this is the real reason why this took place and how did it happen, okay? So it was natural law. Everybody has a moral compass. Everyone should have that set goal, that boundary, okay? That line where everyone has a boundary within that that's created for everybody to be able to have a certain amount of rights within society. So we have that, and then we have a utilitarian perspective, which is a theory, but it actually denoted and underpinned aspects of laws, acts, rule of law. So the utilitarian perspective was based on the fact that everyone has the right to pleasure. Every child has the right to have well-being, have safety measures in place, and to have that, okay? So every child has that, okay? Every person is supposed to have this. It's a boundary, so we never go beyond that boundary. We don't go below that boundary, because that's existent on purpose. So that if we are treated unfairly, this is when we call the police, for example. This is when the policemen are coming, meant to, right? So when this takes place, we always have that safety net. Right, okay, I need to call the police because I'm not safe in my home, for example, right? So this is sort of like how we gauged how the police are supposed to help us when boundaries are breached, how people are supposed to help us when something's happened that's breaching not just a moral code, because that's the moral code of conduct, that's deontology, but when somebody is harming us. Okay, so a utilitarian perspective is when harm. Okay, so if you're being harmed, that goes down. That means you can call the police. If somebody is being harmed, okay, it goes down. We need to call the police because we're being harmed now, right? So we can go by understanding that as a utilitarian perspective, this is the why natural law and utilitarianism. This was a boundary created to protect us from violence, hate crime, discrimination, all that stuff, right? So, this is our right, okay, from that concept where everybody in there is protected. You know what that means? So, we can then understand from that position how we can go as far as going into deontology, which is a paper I studied, on theory-based concepts of moral ethics and values. So, what is morally correct? Okay? Within that triangle they created. What's morally correct to conduct in certain ways? Well, let's just get into this. A morally ethic position is, I guess, something that can be recreated under LA regime. So you've got laws and stuff like that all goes under utilitarianism. But then you've got deontology, which is a moral ethic code and conduct. Now, they are supposed to be purporting aspects of deontology alongside utilitarianism, alongside natural law, right? And when this doesn't take place, and they start creating things, and they're not following. If you're following a protocol of deontology, moral ethics and values and codes of conduct, well, everybody has that. So if you can go into a restaurant, for example, and they can say you're not allowed to wear them shoes, you have to leave. Okay. It probably won't happen in a restaurant. It'll probably be like in a nightclub or something. But you can say you're not allowed to wear trainers in there. Let's just say it. Like home, you're not allowed to wear trainers in there. I mean, a restaurant, a nightclub, you're not allowed to wear trainers, for example, right? So it's a strict code of conduct, okay? This is an aspect of deontology, but I'm just doing it on a small scale so you understand. All right, so what can happen under LA regime is they create aspects of moral codes and conduct, right? So what they can do is be really, really strict against you, and they can also implore aspects that you have not followed these codes and conducts or a utilitarian perspective, which leads to the removal of children, for example. So what can happen under this regime is that if they starting to use an aspect of deontology, codes and conducts, which actually the children were originally okay, so under a utilitarian perspective, under a natural law concept, the children were okay, but they've now created these different laws and avenues where you have to adhere to them, right? And they're saying that you haven't followed their deontological perspective, their moral codes and conduct, then they can say, oh, this isn't good enough, we need to take. But what if they have lied, caused gross misconduct, You've explained to them what's going on and they're not listening. They are just being punitive against you. Well, that goes against utilitarianism, the original set code of conduct that was about happiness, well-being and safety. And they have turned it into like points, tick boxes, deontology, codes of conduct, and they've taken that away from you. They've actually gone and come and took something from you and underpinned it as an aspect of deontological perspectives. When the children were happy, safe and well, they are actually using codes of conduct under them regimes against you punitively, right? But if you was already conducting in a way where that was already okay, the deontological perspectives were already completed. However, there were issues with certain things that were taking place that stopped that child from being able to reach its full nourishment, not because of that person, but because of other things going on. But that person who is trying to explain the situation is being used and being punitively punished, goes against the individual that's being removed, utilitarianism, natural law. Then these people aren't conducting appropriately. They are being punitive, using arbitrary means, okay, to disguise because they've been told to do it. It's pretty simple. If you can meet somebody halfway as an actor in the perspective of exercising deontology, so for example, if you have people, so let's go deontology, let's give an example, education officers, CAFCAS officers, right? So they're the people that sort of like exercise that moral code and conduct of ethics, values and stuff like that. They're supposed to be doing that. Social workers, they're supposed to be doing that, right? So what if they're not conducting efficiently? What if you've explained to them what's going on and they're not allowing your voice to be heard? Well, that goes against your own natural utilitarianism, your own human rights, your own position, okay? Then they start and then they take away, they're doing it to those other people too. Or those other children under education regimes, for example. Punitive measures. Oh, I was poorly, it's not good enough. Well, it is, because you have to understand the deontological perspective that you have now removed and you are claiming that's not good enough. And then which ultimately sacrifices the utilitarianism and the natural rule of law. A natural rule of law and a utilitarianism. So you're going against your natural laws, utilitarianism, arguing a deontological perspective, ignoring mitigating circumstances that have been taking place. So what happens when this takes place? If you can follow me, then you're still here. Wow. But what happens when this takes place? It is a deconstruction of that person's individual right, a natural law, human rights, and to be ignorant to the mitigating circumstances is an unfair way to dismantle the family unit or dismantle whatever it is that you had. So if you were unaware of it, for example, say if you was let's go back to deontology, the easy route, you were told you can't wear shoes. I mean, you can't wear your trousers, trainers or something. You just go somewhere where you can. You don't get punitive measures forced against you. You don't get dragged about. You don't, like Cinderella in a dress where they rip all her clothes off. You don't get that. You don't get that under that regime. You're not supposed to be conducting like that. Okay, because you always got to remember the principles and ethics values of natural law and utilitarianism, because this is the whole reason why human rights were created in the first place. Okay, this was a mother archetypal concept to protection. This is a utilitarianism is a mother archetypal energy. Okay, in the upright position, it's an empress concept. Okay, but then you get deontology, where there's all these principles and stuff, and they're like switching and changing it. That's an archetypal energy of a hierophant, right? So if you know tarot or whatever, if you don't, then it's just a father energy, right? So you have to meet those demands of that energy always. This is the baseline, this is the point. But you can switch and change stuff. All you have to do is lay down principles, go through it with that person, okay? But if you're poorly, for example, or if people are coming and you don't know who they are, and they're new people and they just keep coming in, then all that does, it engages aspects of mistrust within the state from a deontological perspective, because they're just pushing people in that you don't even know. That causes mistrust. Okay, so all they're doing is purporting aspects of fear. They're not sticking to a utilitarian perspective. They're not leaving you in a feeling of well-being, safety, security. Okay, so they're trying to, from a ontological perspective, take away utilitarianism. They're taking away your natural law, your divine right, which is a divine right, but under criminological perspective, it's a natural law, right? And this is how it is. So they're taking away those concepts to dismantle you, so then they can do what they want, okay? So from a theoretical perspective, this is an underpinning, and this is how I wanted to sort of explain to the world how it can take place. But not because I'm being horrible, but just because you can't just keep, this is my moral principle, you can't just keep changing stuff and then not say a truth. Like, if I, for example, didn't do one thing on that link, if I didn't follow those links, no, I didn't, I just Googled it, for example, is that a punitive action to take? No, she just found different ways. She chose different links. She chose different ways. She, didn't stick to the extended learning because she'd done it for 3 years and she found it a bit boring. She just wanted to do different ways of exercising. What else can we learn? Does that mean that person is bad? No, it just means that person's gone a different route this time because she was bored of seeing these same links over and over again. And she just wanted to try something new. She wanted to accept that she understood her utilitarian ways. She accepted her natural laws, and she could always fall back on that. When someone from a deontological perspective is creating other things to barrage over exert, and then to take on purpose, well, that goes against our human rights, and that's why it does, okay? Because you're creating spaces to aid and abet a taking of something that's not yours. So that's property, for example. It's not your property, but you're going to try and make it that person has it taken away from them on purpose. For what? Because it doesn't constitute a removal. Okay? It doesn't constitute a removal. So, for example, if you were poorly from a deontological perspective, you're not meeting the demands because you were poorly for 2 weeks. From a deontological perspective, however you understand the mitigating circumstances, which would be that person was poorly, you're allowed 2 weeks off if you're poorly. From a utilitarian perspective, you're nourishing your values, you're nourishing that person back into an aspect of well-being. So there has to be a mitigating circumstance. You can't be well all the time, for example. You have to be poorly. You are poorly sometimes. Very rare. I am poorly. But, for example, if you was poorly, you can't use punitive means from a deontological perspective, creating morals and ethics and values and having to stick to that without accepting mitigating circumstances in order to uphold a utilitarian, a natural law basis. So holding somebody like contempt for being able to do that for a specific period of time, very minimal. If it's exaggerated, then that's a lie. That's fraud, gross misconduct, and there should be sacking offences. But say like if you don't understand those mitigating circumstances that factor in the well-being of those children from a utilitarian perspective and natural law, you go against them in that perspective. You're breaking a chain, right? You are now corrupting a position where that person is doing everything they can for that child, and you corrupt that person. Say, for example, education, that person's poorly, they didn't work for 2 weeks or whatever, but then go back, I don't know, maybe there was somebody in their family that had cancer, right? So they didn't work for like 2 weeks, something like that, but then you add it all together with the breaks that they all had, 6-week holiday, for example. You can't just put it all together and say they didn't work for 3 months, because that person, them children deserve a break. Utilitarianism perspective. So you're trying to break away from utilitarianism and natural law on a state of governance in order to go against their natural law and their utilitarian perspective, which was created in the first place for human rights, from a deontological perspective, ignoring mitigating circumstances. It's a fragmentation of human rights, okay? It denotes to a mistrust of power from a higher perspective of misuse of power. So it stops us, the people, from trusting in a government who's supposed to be purporting those aspects of utilitarianism, because, put simply, it goes against our human rights. It breaks a chain of cooperation with people and the state. So if I go back to the theory on the crown, it breaks the halo of a communication, I guess, with other people, but it just breaks the communication within a state perspective against what, because it's going against a morally justice, it goes against a morally just human right to ignore mitigating circumstances as well that's going on at the same time. So if you go as far as punitive measures to remove under those grounds, all you are doing is acting punitive against the people who are acting utilitarian, who fall back on that mother archetypal energy. It actually corrupts a state, it corrupts the local authority itself. To ignore human rights or utilitarian perspective, it disregards the people's right to well-being, safety. And because you're not purporting those aspects of well-being, safety and safeguarding, and due to just not understanding the mitigating circumstances, then it shows a really big mistrust within the state, that the state aren't acting for you, they are acting against you. Then you take away that person's right, that person's ability to have an aspect of assurance under the local authority, and it breeds an aspect of corruption. So what happens then is past deontology, where you go beyond moral principles and values because you're not adding that circle of understanding, and then you've gone beyond that, you've created your own circle of fallacies. Now that's just where it's an unjustifiable act to conduct that way. And if it goes to the point where you're taking something that's not yours, it's not your property, but you're doing it under a deontological perspective, you're ignoring the utilitarianism perspectives. So it's a destruction of a mother archetypal energy. It's a destruction of a safety, well-being and stuff like that, which is the baseline. So that, like I said at the beginning, you get matriarchal energy, which is the guidelines that originally purported rule of law in the first place for human rights. You're going against that. You're destroying that energy, that archetypal energy. You're destroying it from a rule of law perspective. So if you want to be ignorant, and you're as women as well. So let's go into the history of this quickly. We used to live in a church state, right? So this was before the rule of law. It was integrated. We used to live in a church state rule of law. And what happened is that women who dressed like nuns pretended or acted in certain ways from a deontological perspective, creating moral ethics and values, but in turn destroyed the human rights. So like, you couldn't be a single woman and be married. You couldn't be if you weren't married, for example, you weren't allowed to keep your children. You had to hide behind, you know, your male family members. If you was a woman, that's how the only way you would be able to keep your children. So if you didn't have male family members in your life, the children would have been taken. Okay, so you had to stand behind them. Okay, so this is kind of like going back into that era, because it's a dismantling of a utilitarian perspective. Okay, so let us understand that if you didn't have a man behind you, whether it was your uncle or your brother or your husband, you would potentially have had those children taken away from you. Okay, under a church state governance. So it's happening in a different way, but it's happening in this era under the rule of law, where LAUs, deontological perspectives, moral principles and values and ethics, where they can switch and change it every time they want, ignoring mitigating circumstances, like, I don't know, what if he died or something like that, but they ignore that, they don't support the person, and then they take anyway. They take well-being, they take your natural sense where you're allowed to have what you've created, your property, your children, for example. Okay. So what happens when this takes place? Well, it's a deconstructive dismantling of what's left of a family. And this is the UK. Okay. So as I understand this from my own papers, my own assessments, my own criminology degree, what I learned, it's almost like it's taking place now on a physical scale, and it's worrying. And I want to share this because I want people to understand what's going on. And if you follow me this long, well, hey, amazing. And, you know, this is why I'm here. I'm here to do this because it's going to happen on a bigger scale if we don't listen. If we don't understand what is going on, what's taking place, it's just going back into reoccurrences of stuff like a religious superstate, where they did take the children, under nuns taking the children, and you don't even want to know what they did with them. You don't even want to know what they did with them. And we claim to be in a different position, in a different world where we weren't there before, it won't happen again and stuff like that. Well, that's not necessarily the case. These children could be very well off with their families, their mothers, and they chose not to let them keep them. The state took the children, the church state. So what do you think was taking place